Good morning, everybody. Welcome you to this August 16th special meeting of the Mojave County Board of Supervisors. Clerk, can you confirm that the other two are on the phone, please?
Supervisor Angus? Supervisor Bishop? They don't appear to be online, but we do have a quorum, so we can proceed.
All right, thank you very much. Official business to come before the board. We have one item. Manager Elters and Director Mornian, want to take it?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and board members. Staff and I appreciate the opportunity to work with you to achieve financial stability. We look forward to providing information, answering questions, doing additional research, and listening to the board members' directions and priorities. Whether it take fewer special board meetings or all of the scheduled ones, we value the dialogue and see it as a productive platform to financial health. We do stand ready to identify where new fiscal policies are needed and to draft language for the board's consideration, review and update existing fiscal policies and practices that may be outdated, do additional research as directed by the board when and as needed to answer questions and offer solutions. Once again, we are really grateful. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to turn it over to Luke Mornian, our Chief Financial Officer, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Manager Elders. So on this first slide, we just really envision this series of meetings as kind of a roadmap for discussion between the board and ourselves. The intent would be that each one of these meetings would run no more than 2 or 3 hours.
Is now joining.
This being the first of a series of monthly meetings focused on dealing with next year's projected budget deficit, as well as the ongoing structural imbalance that exists today within our budget. And so as we move through these slides, the intent is to determine specific areas of focus to include in county fiscal policy, to reach consensus with the board and its overall budget priorities, as well as those specific to the 24-25 budget. And we are looking to receive some direction leading into next month's special meeting on the 20th of September.
Excuse me a second. Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor Johnson.
You called these meetings for us to go over ways to balance the budget. I don't know that listening to the same people that gave me the budget that $16.5 million in the hole is my idea of a good start. I thought we were going to just come up with ideas from the board as to what we wanted done.
I assume this is not just regurgitation of everything that we've heard before. You got some new content, and then we'll open it up to the board members for their suggestions. Is that accurate?
That would be correct, Chairman Lingenfelter.
Okay.
Excuse me, Chairman Lingenfelter. The two other supervisors are now connected online.
Thank you very much. Director Mornian, proceed.
Before I go any further, I did want to ask if any of the board members wanted to provide any commentary as we go into this, because Chairman Lingenfelter, you did call for these meetings. So if you have any remarks that you want to provide.
I'd open it up to the board for remarks. Supervisor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is kind of not how I envisioned this going. I don't need a rundown on financial terms. I'm 63 years old. When I was 23, I started a business. 12 years later, I sold that business and moved to Arizona. I started another business and continued to run that business today for 28 years. I've been a city councilman. I've been a state senator. I sat on the finance committee of the state senate for 8 years. I sat on appropriations for 6 years. So I don't need an explanation of financial terms. What I would like to do is we should be determining with this first meeting the order at which we're going to go through each department to see where we can find cuts. So that's actually what we should be going over today, is how are we going to handle these meetings? Which departments are we going to do first, so that we can take a look at those departments and come in with questions for that department head. That's what I'm hoping to see here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Other comments from board members?
Can you?
Is that Supervisor Angus?
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I'm kind of on that line of Supervisor Gould. We're going to have to rethink if we're going to make drastic cuts, things that, you know, we can't just cut here and there and expect to get that much. So we have some things that are big, like, for example, it's just an example, you know, selling the fairground. We're talking about a lot of money. And if we're going to make any difference, we're going to have to do something big. And so I'm hoping that ideas like this, you know, going through every department and cutting out 100,000 here and 100,000 there is not going to do it. It's not. So if we're not going to have any source of revenue, then we're going to have to come up with some big ideas. So I'm not saying that for today, but that should be on the agenda for meetings ahead, so we can all kind of think about it and suggest something that might be meaningful.
Thank you, Supervisor. Any other comments from our board members? You know, I would say one of the papers, I think it was the Havasu paper, they did an editorial, an opinion piece. And at the end of that opinion piece, they basically said, the citizens, the taxpayers of this county deserve for this board to go through and look for any sort of opportunities in departments to identify cost avoidance, cost savings, efficiencies before we look at any sort of a new revenue stream. And I agree with that. I think that we're going into an election season where we have a lot of candidates already. It's already very early. I mean, it's about a year before the primary, and you start to hear these catchphrases like, well, we need to cut the fat. And that statement, you hear that every election season, but, you know, these meetings, I would hope, wouldn't just be for our board, but for the citizens that we serve. I know that we've all heard it before, but I think it's important for everybody to understand as we go through this exercise, as our supervisors have indicated their desire to go through and suggest changes or suggest areas where we might need staff to look at for cost savings in order to balance at least a portion of the projected general fund shortfall for next year. How we go about that, there definitely needs to be a framework. I'm looking through sort of the backup, and I think it's important to talk about, you know, everything that the county does as far as their services. What is your definition? Because I don't think we really delved into when you divided everybody into mandated, essential, and discretionary, what those definitions and those terms really mean. Is it something that's statutorily required by law as a political subdivision of the state? Is it something that the county started a long time ago, and why did it start, and is it still necessary? That kind of stuff. So, I mean, we can go through this, but I definitely want to have it. You know, first after you give your information, just very brief, we'll open it up to the board members with some recommendations or some asks, some requests that maybe you guys can come back next meeting with some answers. There might be some changes that are suggested by one board member, and maybe other board members value that service, or the people that they serve value that service, and so not everybody is going to agree to cut back on those things. But those are conversations we need to have, so kind of long-winded, but go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Lingenfelter and Supervisor Gould. To your point, I'm well aware that everybody that sits on the board has been dealing with government finance and budgets for some time. My intent is to briefly go through some key terms for the benefit of anybody else that might be watching or listening to this meeting, to make sure that everybody that does not have that same background does have some level of understanding of what we're going through. It's also, the intent is to draft policy that aligns with the board's priorities, so that when we, the county manager and I, present a budget to the board, it does address those priorities, so that, you know, we are all on the same page. Starting this early on in the process is great, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today and to try and get that alignment going before we start into the next year's budget process. So I'll try and move through this as quickly as I can. So thank you for those comments. So just very quickly, and we've discussed this before, a balanced budget, there's a statutory definition, and then there is the recommended definition. And as I move through these slides, anytime you see something highlighted in blue, that would be my recommendation as the Chief Financial Officer, that when we draft a budget policy, we include these terms as they're written. So a structural balance is simply revenues equal to expenditures, but the statutory definition does allow for one-time revenues to be used to make that budget balance. Financially sustainable structural balance is where you have ongoing recurring revenues equal to your ongoing recurring expenditures, and it does not allow the use of one-time revenues to make that budget balance. And so I would just ask the board, if they, as we draft policy, do you want us to go with the statutory definition? Do you want to have flexibility to use one-time revenues to plug a hole in the budget? Or would you like to go with the more strict definition? Because the use of one-time revenues is certainly a big piece of what is generating that projected deficit next year. It's something that's been done over several years. And so if we're looking to not just fix this problem in fiscal 25, and we truly want to address it on a long-term basis, this is the recommendation, that this is how we move forward.
Comments from board members? You want to keep that definition up on the screen, please? Thanks.
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor Johnson.
I don't know what good it's going to do. You came to us with a budget a month ago that was structurally unbalanced, and we made no effort to balance the budget. So I don't know. And now by passing the budget that we passed, we put ourselves, what, $18.5 million in the hole. I mean, the only way out is through an increase in revenues. I don't think this board can cut $18.5 million out of services that we have, and we're at an impasse on that. So this should have been done last budget session, you know, before we got into the hole that we're in, but that's just my opinion.
Thank you. I mean, as far as my comment, Luke, I mean, the definition looks fine.
So recurring revenues, we all know what this is. Revenues that
Gene Bishop
repeat themselves year after year. Our property
is now
taxes
exiting.
that are levied and collected locally is a great example of this. I just want to point out that sometimes recurring revenues do have some element of volatility to them. So an example would be the treasurer's investment earnings. You know, in fiscal 23, they were more than 500% what they were in fiscal 22 because interest rates went through the roof, and so we're earning a lot more on those investments. The conservative approach would be to take a 3 to 5 year average of those earnings and use that as the budget forecast rather than just going on a year-by-year basis. And as an example, our current budget includes about $1.3 million in investment earnings. That's what's projected to be earned over the next year. If we looked at a 5-year average, the treasurer's investment earnings for the county is about $700,000. If we look at a 3-year average, it's about $550,000 because FY22 was extremely low. And so the recommendation, again, would be to take the more conservative approach and to budget accounting for that element of volatility. Then we get into one-time revenues, and just very quickly, obviously not expected to continue or repeat year after year. We get a number of different things that would be identified as one-time revenues. The ARPA monies recently is a great example of that. We don't expect that to continue. And so these one-time revenues, taking the conservative approach, would generally not be used to fund ongoing and recurring expenditures. Some recommended uses: debt reduction, building up reserves, capital improvements, or technology-related efficiencies. I would like to ask the board if they have any other priorities or uses that they would want to earmark one-time revenues for as we draft policy. Okay, thank you. And then as we draft policy, the intent would be to prioritize those uses of one-time revenues. And so the recommendation would be that they first be used to increase reserves if they're needed, to restore fund balances where they've been drawn down below the recommended guidelines, used for debt reduction, and then lastly for capital improvements. The recommendation to address debt before capital improvements is to generate those longer-term savings. If we can reduce our debt, pension debt, that frees up future budget capacity to deal with other expenses. And again, I would ask the board if you agree with this prioritization or if you would like to provide alternate.
Any comments from the board members?
Mr. Chairman,
Manager Elters.
in those areas where Luke is asking for input from the board, we will gladly take feedback later on as well. These policies that we hope to put in front of the board are not drawn, do not have to be drawn tomorrow. So we welcome any thoughtful feedback at any time between now and the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
So one thing that we were asked to include and address today is the definitions of the service levels of mandated, essential, and discretionary. And so the definitions that I'm going to go through here, as you have asked about, Supervisor Lingenfelter, these were provided to departments at the beginning of the fiscal 23 or fiscal 24 budget formulation. So we provided these definitions. The departments categorized the services they provide in these three categories and gave that information back to finance, and that is what was included in the fiscal 24 budget. So a mandated expense is something required by law, regulation, ordinance, or contract, specifically ASRS or the Arizona Constitution. One example would be the Office of the Public Fiduciary that is enacted in statute, ARS 145601. Basically says you shall have an Office of a Public Fiduciary and the associated services, so mandated by law. The definition we used for essential services would be services necessary for the public health, safety, and welfare of citizens. And again, it could be referenced in statute not as a shall, but as a may, or enabled by a policy action of the board. An example of this in our current budget would be the senior programs administered by the Public Health Department. They are not required by law, but they do provide a very necessary service to a segment of our population. And then lastly, discretionary services would be those that are simply provided for prevention, maintenance, comfort, convenience, cost efficiencies, and they might be enabled by board action. They could also be just an industry best practice that is commonly and widely used. I would use the example of some of the services that our procurement department provides, such as delivering mail throughout this building, or they order paper by the pallet to obtain bulk discounts, and then distribute the paper to the departments within the admin building. So a topic of discussion that we've gone over before is how does our budget look when you break it down into these three service categories? And so this first slide, this is the entire $580 million budget for the county for fiscal '24. This includes the general fund, it includes all other funds, every single department, whether they are funded by the general fund or whether they are funded by fees that they generate for services that they provide. We've also included in the left hand of this slide contingency, because in order to balance with the budget schedules that we provide to the state each year, that $580 million total, a big portion of that is contingency, not just the general fund's contingency, but also contingency funds that other departments maintain. On the right-hand side, you can see a breakdown of the revenue sources that make up that $580 million budget. You can see that about a quarter of it is general fund, local revenues, property taxes that are levied and collected, or state shared revenues that we receive from the state. There's about another quarter of it is state and federal grant monies that are received. We have about 35% of it that is fees and other, and I'll just point out that looks like a huge piece of the budget, but there's over $100 million in there that is basically unawarded, and it's basically just a budget tool so that we must budget for any expenses or any funds in order to spend them when we receive them. And so when ARPA came about and the county received $40 million, we had, I believe, a $2 million unawarded slot in the budget. So that's been drastically increased over the last couple of years. Some examples, say a monsoon washes out a bridge or a road, and Public Works is able to get immediate grant funds to assist with that construction project. If we haven't budgeted for that, we can't spend those monies when they're received. And so that's a big component of that fees and other portion. And then the last piece is fund balance. Expenses are not always contained in one fiscal year. And so those carryover balances that roll over into the next fiscal year are also budgeted.
Director Morney, and I've got two questions. First, are you going to make this presentation available to the board members? If you would send this to them after
Absolutely.
the meeting. And then the second question I have on this slide, and maybe I'm a little bit confused. Prior conversations, I thought I heard over 80-something% was mandated services, and this one says 40. So can you explain that to me?
Chairman, I'll cover that on the next slide. That 80, upwards of 80% is actually when we look at just the general fund.
Thank you.
And so exact same setup on this slide. On the left-hand side, you can see the breakdown between mandated, essential, discretionary, and then also including contingency in there. It's about 85% mandated across the general fund. And then on the revenue side of things, you can see it's about 92% property tax and state shared revenues. The other 8% is fees generated by some of our fee-driven department. And I'll just point out, you can see there's only two categories on that revenue side, and this is an issue we've discussed before, but we don't have much in the way of diverse revenues coming into the county. The last term that I really want to define as we look to draft policy is public safety. This has been a repeated topic of discussion amongst board members. And so from our view, public safety really has four components. It has law enforcement, it has our judicial system, prosecution and defense. And so the related departments are listed under each one of those headings. I would ask if the board has any input or opinions on how we have defined public safety, if you agree, disagree.
I'd open it up to the board for comments. Hearing none, proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. Next, I'm just going to very quickly review the two capital projects that we have. The first one being the Law and Justice Center. The original project allocation for this was actually earmarked back in fiscal 2000 from sales tax revenue. It was $34.25 million. Since that time, this project was split into multiple phases. Phase 1 was completed in FY21 to the cost of about $24 million. Phase 2 is in progress. Construction plans have been approved. The project is ready to go out to bid. It's incurred just shy of $1 million in expense to date, and it has an $8 million budget in the current year's budget. And then the other capital project that we have slated is the Legal Services Center. The current status of that is about $850,000 to date. The two biggest pieces of that would be the Pine Street Jail demo, as well as the design. And it was a $500,000 budget for the demolition of the Pine Street Jail. It ended up costing about $465,000. And then there's been about $375,000 spent on design. And that has a $9.7 million budget in the current fiscal year. And it is pending procurement of construction services. And the board pressed the pause button on that at the last Board of Supervisors meeting. So as I've stated before, I do see a need for an actual formal budget policy so that we can include the board's priorities, the board's interests in that policy as we go about crafting a budget. The intent would be to have a policy that defines strategic priorities. It highlights the risks and opportunities as we see them and as the board sees them. It can provide a framework for discussion and decisions made throughout the year, and it's obviously a useful term for long-term planning. And so my intent would be to receive the input from the board today on what your priorities are, what matters most to you, and then draft a policy and bring that back at next month's budget meeting.
You looking for input now or later in the meeting?
Later in the meeting, Chairman. Along with that operating budget policy, I'd like to formalize a fund balance policy. We do have an informal policy that's been used in practice. The intent of a fund balance policy, again, is to provide for sufficient cash flow, secure and maintain bond ratings if we ever needed to go out to bond, offset economic downturns or revenue shortfalls, and provide funds for unforeseen expenses. And so again, I would bring back a draft policy of that at next month's budget meeting. And so with that, I would open it up for discussion and ask the board, what are their
Is
priorities?
now exiting.
Not just for the fiscal 25 budget, but moving forward long-term. Would really like to kind of hear and get input on what is the vision of the board, where do they see the county heading, and how would you like us to help facilitate that with the budget?
Thank you. I'm going to give every one of our board members an opportunity to provide input. Madam Clerk, we'll start with Supervisor Bishop. Is Supervisor Bishop still on the line? Does she want to provide comments?
Supervisor Bishop, are you still on the line? I believe she exited, and I can't get a response from her on the phone either.
Okay. Supervisor Angus, does she want to provide some input?
I believe she just exited. Supervisor Angus, are you there?
All right, we'll move on. Supervisor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not really here to lay out policy before we have the discussion and take a deep dive into the department's budgets. I don't think that this is the way that we should do it. We need to get into it before we create broad policies. And if you were going to create policies, they probably should have been created before we ended up with an $18 million deficit. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Supervisor Johnson?
I agree with Supervisor Gould. This should have been done a long time ago. This isn't the place for it. Those meetings were called to try to get out of the hole that we were dug into. I can't stress how strongly I feel that we were brought a budget at the budget session that put us in this hole, and now we're asked to get us out of this hole. So I think it's up to the board to figure out what they're going to do collectively to get us out of this hole.
Thank you, Supervisor. I agree. It would have been preferable to get this solved before today, but obviously we couldn't get there to a package that was satisfactory to everybody, which is why we are calling these meetings. I think it's the general fund that we need to balance here. So what's the biggest cost to the county general fund? I'll just lay out some broad thoughts, if I may. The county general fund, the biggest cost of that is personnel costs, and I want to make sure that we protect our people. I don't think that this county board wants to be in a position where we have to lay off people. And I think back to prior finance directors and prior city managers, and when the county was last in a position that I recall.
Is now joining.
Yeah, she's got several little puncture wounds. Only one of them deep.
Could we have her mute?
And she
Excuse me.
thinks that
Supervisor
we're
Bishop?
sparkly bit of too.
Is now joining.
Supervisor Bishop?
All right, I'll continue. I'm wondering what our average turnover is every year. And again, I know that the things that I'm going to list out aren't going to solve 18.5 million, but these are suggestions that I think I'd like to have us look at. So through HR, what's our average turnover? And then if you were able to cost out the salary expense of that turnover, wages, benefits, PTO, what dollar amount does that equate to? I'd like to look at that. I know in past years, when the county knew that it was looking at a significant projected possible deficit, that there was talk about implementation of a hiring freeze on general funded positions. And in that situation, the county manager would obtain specific override from this Board of Supervisors for positions that impact public health and safety. For those positions that obtain specific override, general funded positions would remain frozen until the PTO payout for that existing employee is recaptured. And then you could start advertising and recruiting for that position. Also in prior years, I remember that administration, county manager's office, financial services department worked very closely with our departments that were general funded to request, they distributed an Excel spreadsheet to departments requesting that all departments that are general funded, where they would recommend 5 to 10% general funded account cuts. And then that list could be reviewed with the Board of Supervisors as well. Something else I'd like to look at is, and I'm not sure how long it would take you to bring back, Luke, but a current list of general funded Mojave County essential or discretionary service contracts that we have right now. All of the options that we have right now are not great. from my understanding, you know, aside from those and any other suggestions that our board gives, the only other thing that we can do is press the pause on our capital improvement program, and maybe that buys us a year or two. But hopefully these sessions will be productive. I think whatever all of us put into it is what we'll get out of it. So those are my initial suggestions that I'd like to look at.
Thank you, Chairman Lingenfelter. I will just say, as far as the your comments regarding hiring freezes and the basically not advertising a position until the PTO payout has been accounted for, that is a practice that really is currently in place. We recommend placement into a position once it's vacated after the PTO payout has been accounted for, plus 2 pay periods is when we recommend the start date on those. With the exception being if a department has vacancy savings, which just about every department does due to our high vacancy rate, they can bring someone on prior to that because they're still staying under budget for the year. Wasn't sure if you were aware of that, but that is something that has been a practice that has been in place since the last financial downturn.
I appreciate that, but we don't have a current hiring freeze in place right now.
Not a hiring freeze.
And if I was a very, very conservative financial director, I mean, it might be one of the things that I look at. It's not going to plug the whole hole, but I mean, every little bit, it's like an all of the above type of a solution, right? So I think it's something that we need to look at. I think one of the biggest things that happened, or one of the things that contributes, is a couple of years ago, in an effort to try to take care of our employees, which we should, we provided across the board salary raises on one-time revenues. And I don't think that the assumptions that went along with that have really panned out 2 years later. So, but I think what I'm trying to protect is we don't ever want to be in a situation where we have to actually whittle down staff.
I completely agree, Chairman. I will just point out that the idea of hitting pause on capital projects, while that does give us some room to breathe, so to speak, it does nothing to address the structural imbalance. Again, that is essentially using one-time revenues, because when we say we're going to defund a capital project, you have an influx of money into the current year's budget or the next year's budget, but at some point that project is necessary. They've been programmed for a reason, and you have to refund that project. And so if we don't have either an increase to the overall ongoing revenues or a decrease to the overall ongoing expenditures, hitting pause there or completely canceling capital project does not address that deficit.
Mr. Chairman,
Manager Elters.
as part of the ongoing dialogue and these meetings for September, we will be happy to model. We did some of that already in prior meetings with the board. We will go back and model taking the CIP projects out and showing what impact that will have. And it will basically get us through 25, and it won't go any further, but we will update that model, bring it back in September, and share it with the board.
Great. In addition, I think that as we've heard from our board members that, our citizens deserve us to go through, as has been requested, line by line, and we'll go through and we'll listen to suggested cuts. And if we can come to a majority consensus on those cuts, I think that we owe that to the people that we serve before we look at any sort of a new revenue source. So,
Chairman Lingenfelter, thank you for those comments. Looking ahead to September's meeting, if we're going to go through every general fund department, line by line, expense by expense, when do you envision, I guess, having us complete that? If we were to try and do that in one meeting, I can tell you it's going to be over multiple days. Would you like to do that in September and October? it still, I think, is going to require more than a couple 3-hour
Yeah, I
meetings.
understand the question. Let me open it up to the board because I think we need to get some dialogue and some impact. Supervisor Johnson, how would you like to see the next meeting function?
I think, not speaking for Supervisor Gould, but I think he wanted to go through each department. I can tell you that when I first took office, we were in financial trouble and we cut 10% across the board for 3 or 4 years and got back into where we needed to be. The hole we're in now was created by the board. And it's put us in a position where the only way we are going to cut money is through employees. That's the only way we're going to get out of it unless you raise revenue. So if you're going to do something, unless Supervisor Gould wants to go through every line item, you say, hey, it takes 10% to get where we need to be or 20% where we need to be. We tell staff to go back and come back with a budget with a 20% cut, and they can explain, you know, well, we had to cut this many people out of finance, this many people out of here. We can work or we can't work. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Supervisor. Supervisor Gould.
You can either go through line by line and find cuts, or you can tell the department heads to find the cuts in their department. And when I was in the legislature, we did it both ways. And we expected the people to make the appropriate cuts, and we found out they did not make the appropriate cuts.
These are our meetings. How would you like to have it
I would like to
operate?
go through the departments. So I pick a department or two, a meeting to go through the departments and have them justify their budget. You know, I'm just looking at the animal shelter went up 37%.
All right. Do we have Supervisor Angus? Do you have any comments on how you would like to see the next meeting function?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it's a combination of what President Johnson and President Gould said. I agree. Again, I want to reiterate that it is not like we're doing this now, and I think it needs to be said for the record. We're not in this predicament because we have spent like drunk sailors. 37%, that's the number, right? The animal shelter, that's almost solely due to inflation. We're in this predicament because of inflation. Correct?
Director Mornian?
Chairman Lingenfelter, Supervisor Angus, it's a combination of inflation and going back several years of using one-time revenues to plug budget holes.
Right.
To that point,
Yeah, it was tricky to keep taxes lower for people. And, you know, because we did that, we are now in this kind of position where, yeah, we can cut some, absolutely, but we have to get revenue in. You know, I don't want to lead people to believe that we could cut, because I believe, and I'm going to say this, I'm not even shy about saying this, this county has done a fantastic job in keeping taxes down and functioning as we have to according to state statutes. So of course it should go through, and yeah, I think probably should do that before every budget goes through it. But I think that it has to be the departments, not us. I mean, I don't want to micromanage every department. They should come to us and say, this is where we think that we could save, because frankly, I don't know what it takes to run a assessor's office or a public works office, what you have to statutorily do. So I think instead of going through line by line and then finding out what it is, that you have to come to us. You have to do it. That'll be save time, save energy, and maybe we can actually get something done.
Thank you, Supervisor. Supervisor Gould, you had a comment?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the reason that the animal shelter costs us more money than it did before is from a policy decision that we took the animal shelter in-house rather than letting a contract to a private group. And then we had to build a new animal shelter also. So this is a policy decision. It was not inflation driven. Part of that's inflation driven, but part of that is the new cost from taking that department in-house and making all those people full-time county employees with full-time benefits. It's a policy decision. Thank you.
Supervisor Bishop, do you have any comments on how you'd like to see the next meeting function? She's still with us.
Chairman Lingenfelter, I believe she can hear us. If she wants to say something, she needs to unmute her phone if she can hear me. Otherwise, I don't know how else to.
Supervisor Bishop, did you have any comments on how you'd like to see the next meeting function?
Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Hello?
Oh. Please proceed.
Okay. So you probably figured out that in the midst of this meeting, I was involved in a multiple dog fight with injuries. So I didn't get to hear a lot of the input. It's hard to hold two dogs back and talk on a cell phone at the same time. So I think that the county manager and the finance department, the finance director, should be doing more than just holding these monthly meetings at the request of a supervisor. I think we're in this position because of inflation. I agree with Supervisor Angus on that. I'm not too sure I agree with Supervisor Gold about the animal shelter, but that's just one peg in one hole. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be looked at, but I don't think we're going to be able to cut $18 million out of the budget. But I commend the supervisors that think they can do that, and I'll participate. But I think the end result is we either have to cut services and maybe employees, or we have to raise the property taxes or get a sales tax. And I think just saying no to sales tax is ridiculous. I think Supervisor Gold needs to take a look at the end of all these meetings and consider maybe that's going to be the answer to this going forward. That's all I have. I'm going to go back and enjoy my vacation.
Supervisor Bishop. Supervisor Gould, do you have a comment?
Let me crack the code for the public here. The purpose of this meeting is to browbeat me into a sales tax. That's what this is about. So don't be deceived by anything else. This is what this is about, to make me sit through this to somehow submit to a sales tax. We've heard fallacious arguments for a sales tax. We had a poll in the Lake Havasu City paper that said that 24% of the people supported a sales tax. We need to learn to live within our means. But that's why we're here today, is so that I can be browbeat into a sales tax. And, I don't know that I'm going to sit through a monthly meeting for the next 12 months just to be browbeat, but thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. I can assure everybody that's here and that's watching that I'm not here to try to browbeat anybody. I'm here because we have a projected $18.5 million projected general fund deficit, and I'm here to try to help solve it.
Chairman Lingenfelter?
Supervisor Angus, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very surprised at the comments by Supervisor Gould. I think you think a little bit high of yourself. I'm not here to browbeat you or anyone. I want to fix what's happening in this county. And I resent that notion that we're here because of you and you alone. So I just wanted that on the record.
To finish my comments, I think it's absolutely important, although it's going to be tedious, and you might hear complaining, that we go through and we look, again, like I said, for cost avoidance opportunities, for cost savings opportunities, for efficiency opportunities. It's never a bad idea when you're serving the public to do that. But why I'm here primarily is because this organization, we have a duty to continue county business. We have to continue business operations of this county. And that's why I'm here. We'll go through this general funded budget, and we'll identify all the opportunities that we can have a majority agree upon. We'll look at our capital improvement plan, see what we can have a majority agree upon. But as I sit here, I think that we're going to find some things that we can maybe find some efficiencies. I don't think it's going to be to the level of $18.5 million. So then it presents some really tough challenges, right? We can, as a board, if 3 out of 2 votes to raise primary property tax to the level that only 3 can, that still isn't enough to solve the projected budget. If you had 5 that voted to adopt an increase the primary property tax, then you could raise it to a level that might help. But I don't think that you have 5 members that are going to vote to max out our primary property tax rate. What would it be, over $2 per hundred? Do you remember off the top of your head?
I believe the maximum rate, Chairman Liebenfelter, is 230 something.
Yeah. So I see that as a pie in the sky option. It's not going to happen here. And then the other thing that we can do is we can view it through the terms of total combined tax rate, which would include some sort of a sales tax. And from what I've heard, and I'm not trying to convince anybody, but just from my own chair, something that is very important to my constituents is that we fully fund sheriff's office and law enforcement and public safety. Most of the folks that I represent half of Kingman in majority rural communities, and they consistently talk to me about response times and public safety and these types of things. And it's a challenge. So the solutions that I've heard would be something that is 100% dedicated to law enforcement. It would create some space in the general fund, which is what we're talking about today. It would actually allow us to even decrease the primary property tax rate for people that live here, for small businesses, for seniors. There would be, as it was explained to me, some sort of a circuit breaker option that if the current board that we sit on tries to increase property taxes, that everything would go back to square one and that money that was dedicated to law enforcement would be removed. I don't have any control over a future board that I'm not a part of. That's not my responsibility, and it's up to that board at that point. But I think we're in a tough spot when you look at the options right now. If you looked at it as a total combined tax rate, I think we could get to a solution that was negotiated that would keep Mojave County the 3rd lowest combined tax rate in the whole state of Arizona amongst the 15 counties. So I think for the next meeting, Manager Elters, you need some more direction, or go ahead.
Mr. Chair?
Supervisor Johnson.
You said that the maxing out of the property tax would cover this or not cover the debt?
Believe so. We are at $1.75 per $100 of assessed value. The max rate is, off the top of my head, I think it's either $232 or $237 per $100 of assessed value. So you're looking at about a 50-cent raise to the max value, give or take. Each penny represents about $250,000. So no, it wouldn't quite get us all the way there.
Right, so we could have done 22 cents a month ago and balanced the budget till 2031, but now we're facing where we can't even raise it the max. I would say, and I would make a motion that, well, I guess I have one more question before I make a motion. We brought up the idea of a jail district. Did anybody look into that?
Chairman Liebenfelter, Supervisor Johnson, absolutely. We explored the idea of a jail district. The biggest hurdle there for why it's not a viable option is something called a maintenance of effort. If you do a jail district, an excise tax funded jail district, the way that the statutes that govern that are written, they reference a maintenance of effort. And so right now, whatever the county is providing in general funds to the operation of the jail, operation and maintenance of the jail. You cannot supplant those monies with a jail district tax. So the statutes for jail districts, as we've discussed with CSA, were largely written to enable counties that have an immediate and pressing need to either replace a jail that has been deemed unsafe or, it's just unfit for use, or for a county that does not have a jail and now needs to construct a jail. And so they are able to levy that tax, and essentially starting from zero. They're not currently funding a jail, and then they go to having to fund a jail. And so the jail district tax is to allow for that marked and immediate increase in cost to their budget without overwhelming their budget. But for Mojave County, we've had a jail for a number of years, and we currently, spend upwards of $20 million on that jail each year, funded by the general fund. And so we would not be allowed to supplant any of those current funds. We have to maintain those in the years going forward. So a jail district tax would only be able to use to offset increases to that overall funding and expense in years to come.
But we're looking at sales tax to cover that in the future. That it was a sheriff's override looked at? Or can that even be done with our property tax so low?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Johnson, my understanding is a sheriff override cannot be done when we have capacity in our property tax and we have no sales tax. And I would say additionally to what you heard from Director Mornian related to the jail district, we did explore it with other counties that went through that, Supervisor, including Coconino, who had one in the past and renewed it recently, Cochise County, who just went through establishing one, and it's the Auditor General that determines what that maintenance of effort is and what you can, when you can assign to it. So it truly is not viable for us at this time.
Thank you. So my motion would be that Mojave County puts a hiring freeze on, freezes all travel, and any other building projects that are going forward.
Attorney Esplin.
I don't think that's within the scope of what we're talking about today. If you want to put that on, I think that's something you put on the next agenda. Just looking at the scope of the agenda, it's to discuss the overall budget process and issues and concerns about the upcoming budget, including the projected fiscal deficit and possible scenarios. You could do actions related to that, but do something like that, I would recommend you put on a separate one. You could put it on a future agenda, you could put it on another agenda, but I don't think that would be in order.
So what you're saying, Mr. Attorney, is that we had a meeting where we actually accomplished nothing? Thought this meeting was supposed to be so we come up with some ideas.
Is now exiting.
It is for ideas, and a lot of ideas have been submitted. I think this has been a worthwhile discussion, but in terms of the action you're proposing, I don't think it's been properly agendized. I'm not saying you can't do it in the future, and go ahead and put it on the next agenda if you wish, or any future agenda. You're welcome to do that. I just want to make sure that the county is complying with the open meeting law.
What action, it says discussion, possible action, what action can we take today?
You can take actions that are related to the overall budget process and issues and concerns about the upcoming fiscal budget. The actions you're talking about today are contemplating things that are happening right now that wouldn't necessarily be related to the overall budget process for the 2024-2025 fiscal year.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman,
Manager Elters.
to facilitate the review of the budget on a department by department basis and perhaps correlate it to mandated, essential, and discretionary services. I suggest, if it's acceptable to the board, that we come back in September with information to the board to look at and consider that would present each department and the funding that they receive, whether it's general fund, grant, fees or otherwise, and just to start at least at that level and show you what each department receive, what each department total budget is, what it consists of, and then what we can do to explain to the board the correlation between what's mandated, and we can discuss the mandate level and the legislation, but to begin that process of going through department by department as clearly the board as a whole wishes to explore and exercise.
Thank you, Manager Alters. And are you talking about focusing specifically on general funded essential services and discretionary services? I mean, we wouldn't, or are we talking about mandated as well?
Mr. Chairman, I thought we would do all of it. It's important, I think, for the board to see the mandated and the essential and discretionary, and for the board to say, yeah, we agree or we don't agree. Maybe we're taking a different interpretation that the board does. But I think it would really be, I'm thinking if we're gonna go through this deep dive into the departments, let's do so. Let's bring you a list of the department, their budget, of that budget, what is general fund, what's grant, and what's fees and others, and then talk about the mandated services of that department and the essentials. It's just a suggestion to facilitate that process. So we can get through it in a reasonable time. We can take one board meeting or two special board meetings, however long it takes to satisfy the board of what we have and answer your questions to help you assess, what the overall conditions are and where we go from here. It's a suggestion.
Any feedback from the board members or any opposition to that proposal?
Mr. Chair?
Supervisor Johnson.
I don't know that we need to hear from like Mr. Letowski and the departments on the only ones that can help us with our $18.5 million in the hole. And I would think instead of having brought back the way that the manager was discussing, we decide, maybe Mr. Moynihan can tell us what percentage of a cut to the general fund would get us even. If that's 10%, 20%, 30%, we just say, okay, those departments that are general funded come back with the appropriate cut and tell us exactly how you can run your department with that or how you can't run your department with it. Because unless you give them some kind of direction on what they have to do, they're not going to come back with what we need. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Any other comments from board members? Hearing none, Manager Alters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we are prepared. We'll be glad to go through and provide that information to the board. But back to the definition, when we say, I think what Supervisor Johnson is asking is, what cuts are necessary to mitigate this budget deficit? Are you saying, Supervisor Johnson, across the board, or is your preference to leave public safety and the justice system out of it?
Supervisor Johnson.
Yeah, that's our biggest drain on general fund monies are those. I don't want to see them cut any more than anything else, but we have no other place to cut. And I think when we're having these meetings, you've got all your staff here who probably could be better used, back.
Kelsey
is now joining.
I don't know that they all need to be here for all these meetings either. I mean,
Thank you, Manager Alters.
but I would just say, hey, whatever it is, I don't know if Mr. Moynihan, do you know what percentage of a cut to the budget we would have to make?
Chairman Lingenfelter, Supervisor Johnson, we did run numbers on that. If we are including every general fund department across the board, including capital projects, every single use of general fund money, we would be looking at about a 17 to 18% cut.
I would just come back with an 18% cut to all departments. I mean, it's only fair way.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Of course, I might want to look at the county attorney a little closer now, but.
Director Mournian, just to, one thing that Supervisor Johnson said that I still think is a viable option is the jail district. Although, you know, it doesn't help us at all with the current situation. It is something that could help the county long-term. I mean, you have this maintenance of effort provision, but it would help from whenever that line is established or that limit is established, anything above and beyond that would help lighten the burden on the general fund. So although it doesn't help us in the short term, it doesn't help us with what we're trying to deal with today, I still think it remains a viable long-term solution, even though that's not really what we're talking about.
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do we have the details on what it takes to form a jail district? Is that a vote of the board, a vote of the people?
If it goes to the vote of the people, does it not, Director Mournian? Manager Elters?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Gould, thank you. It is a ballot initiative. Actually, there are two paths that you can take, one through the board, one through the ballot, one through a ballot initiative. When we explored these two options, it looked to us like the ballot initiative is the easiest path is the easier of the two. I don't remember many of the details right now, but it could be either or. I think there may be limitation on the amount, but if you would like to revisit that, please allow us until the next board meeting. We'll go back, review, and refresh our memories and come back to you with answers.
I think that would be a good idea, just so we know the mechanics of doing that. What does it actually take, and let the folks know what it actually takes.
Jail taxing district, yes, they can be either property tax driven or sales tax driven. I believe there's two avenues to get there. I think either the Board of Supervisors by vote can call for the question to be placed on a ballot, or the petition, and I'm not sure who the champion of that petition collecting process would be.
Yeah, I doubt the citizens are going to circulate a petition to tax themselves. That generally does not motivate people.
If you'd bring that back, that'd be great. Yeah, Manager Elters, anything else?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I think I lost my thought for a moment. No, other than, again, for the September special board meeting, we'll be happy to bring back the answers to the questions that you're asking for related to the percentage of cut required, whether it's across the board or if certain segment or sector of services is left out. But we'll be happy to bring that back.
Great. So it looks like our next meeting is going to be September 20th. Is that accurate?
That's correct, Chairman Lingenfelter.
Any other business? I just want to thank everybody that's in the audience today, everybody that's watching. If you're with the county, we're all in this together. Just appreciate working with everybody to get through this. Manager Elters, anything else?
Mr. Chairman, no, except just food for thought. If I understood correctly, it's the board's intent at some point to solicit some public input. I don't know if you'd like to do that at a, post it for such, and whether you want to allow some more time before we get to that point. But the list of items that you would like answers for is plenty for us to go work on and bring back for the September meeting. But I'm just, this is more of a question than anything else. Thank you.
Chairman Langfelter, real quick, if I could just interject a little bit. These meetings are agendized as a special meeting. They don't have a call to the public, but the
Right.
public is invited to come sign up and speak on this item at your discretion, obviously, but they are able to do so now.
Thank you. Any closing remarks from our Board of Supervisors? Supervisor Johnson? No. Supervisor Gould?
No, thank you.
Supervisor Angus? Supervisor Bishop? Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.